So as you guys are coming in, there is a link in the chat box that has a variety of different pieces of information in it. If you are not ordinarily a Zoom user, you'll find some helpful tips on page 1. So if you are a Zoom user, you can go ahead and skip over that first page and take a look at the content in the rest of the document. My name is Jennifer Goss, and I am actually currently coming to you from Reading, Pennsylvania, where I'm visiting family, but ordinarily I live in Stanton, Virginia, which is in the Shenandoah Valley. And the Shenandoah Valley is a really beautiful area of Virginia. It's in central Virginia, and it is kind of the corridor along which we have many presidential birthplaces. We have some really great wineries, and we have the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. And so I really enjoy living there and teaching there in the city of Stanton at Stanton High School, where I serve as the Social Studies Department Chair. I also currently teach AP US Government and Politics, Dual Enrollment US History 1 and 2, Virginia and US Government to Seniors, as well as a Holocaust and Genocide Studies elective. And I'm entering into my 9th year at Stanton High School, which was actually formerly Robert E. Lee High School. So we've had an interesting journey in the past few years. Prior to that, I taught for 10 years in Fleetwood, Pennsylvania, which is located between Reading and Allentown, where I had a fairly similar course schedule. In my evenings, I serve as an adjunct at Blue Ridge Community College, and I also spend much time working in the field of Holocaust education and Holocaust studies. My initial master's degree from Westchester University is in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and in 2010, I became a museum teacher fellow with USHMM. So I'm super excited to share with you today about Echoes and Reflections, which is a set of resources that I have used in my own classroom since 2006 when I was first introduced to them. They're resources that I know work effectively, and they're also resources that I've found to be very flexible to fit my needs. Echoes has actually been around since 2005, and our primary goal is to provide resources and support to secondary teachers in the United States. And we have an established set of resources that stretch across 11 units, which I'll be telling you a little bit more about in our work today. And we also have many linking resources within our partnerships with USC Shoah Foundation and Yad Vashem. The Anti-Defamation League is the head helming partner, umbrella partner of Echoes and Reflections as well. So these are some organizations that you'll be hearing a little about during the course of our work together in the next 3 days. To date, we've actually now worked with more than 70,000 educators across the United States. We've been really busy since the closure of schools in March. We've pivoted even more strongly to online learning and providing online learning opportunities. You guys are actually our very first participants in a Facebook group hosted conference. And so we're really excited to work with Gabriel and the Social Studies Network to provide this opportunity for each and every one of you. So again, if you haven't already, please be sure to head to the link that Gabriel shared in the chat box and that I have also shared to sign in. This is going to help us track your attendance for your participation certificates over the course of the next several days. Mary Ellen, I'm sorry you're having unstable internet. We are recording this session, so if you have some issues and need to go back and listen to some playback, just touch base with Gabriel and we'll figure out a way to make that work. Our goals today and for the next 2 days are multifaceted. Our primary goal today is going to be delving into sound pedagogy for Holocaust education, because Echoes and Reflections, like many Holocaust education institutions, believes in a very specific approach to this really challenging and tough historical content. We'll be looking at some specific instructional enhancements over the next few days to support student learning while discovering classroom-ready assets, including lesson plans, visual history testimonies, and additional primary source materials. Along the way, we'll hopefully be enhancing your personal knowledge about the Holocaust, including the history of anti-Semitism, which is going to be one of our specific foci for today. And lastly, we're hoping to build your confidence and capacity to teach this rather complex topic. So to begin, what I would like to do is I'd like to share with you the words of a gentleman by the name of Henry Ortelt. Henry is one of over 5 dozen visual history testimony survivors, liberators, or rescuers that are featured within the Echoes and Reflections resources. Henry is actually part of our newest unit on contemporary anti-Semitism. And I'm choosing to begin with Henry today to set our tone for the next several days for some reasons that I will share with you after we listen to his piece of testimony. As you're listening to his testimony, I'd like you to just think, whoops, skipped ahead a slide, sorry. I'd like you to think about, what he's saying, how he's saying it, and then I'd like you to think of one word, either a word he uses in his testimony or a reaction that you might have from listening to his testimony. So here is Henry, without further ado.
I'm speaking an awful lot on all kinds of universities here in the state and out of the state, an awful lot to high schools, in the city, out of the city. And I'm always trying to let the message go through that it is time for people to recognize that the world is made out of many, many different people, different colors, different sizes, and all kinds of differences. That is about time that we recognize that. It's about time that we learn to live with it. And one way to learn to live with it is that, and it is about time for that, that we start to learn about each other. And while we may not agree with the ideology and the lifestyle of other people, it is time, by knowing about them, to respect them as I expect them to respect me. And if this can come down, and I think we're making some progress, not a lot, but I see some progress here and there. If this can come about, then I think the world will be a much better place. And the letters and reactions that I get to my speaking shows an awful lot. I get so many letters that people tell me, I never looked at it that way. And it's just a wonderful thing to it. And from now on, I will be watching out for it. And there were many, many wonderful results that I have out of this. And this is what I'm doing. That's basically my main message, because I tell them, I am the prime example of what can happen to people that are suffering under prejudicial circumstances and biases. And when nobody speaks up, we have to learn to speak up when we see prejudice and hatred.
All right, so just take a moment and think about what Henry shared with us. And in your mind or on a piece of scrap paper nearby, think of one word, either one word that stood out to you that Henry said, or one word that you're thinking in your mind as a reaction to Henry's testimony. What I'd like you to do then with that one word is I'd like you to head to menti.com. You can either open a new tab on your browser, or you can go to a tablet or cell phone and open your browser on there, and you simply go to menti.com. It's going to ask you for a code. The code that you're going to use is 877802. And when you get there, it's going to ask you the question of one word that you want to have in response to Henry's testimony. And so again, when you get to the site 877802, and then it's going to ask you for one word. It will then also advance you to a next slide, but for now, please just ignore that next slide and put your device aside. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with Menti, you can actually get free access to it, and I've provided information for that access to you in the big Google Doc that Gabriel's sharing with everyone. And for those of you that are just joining us, if you click on that Google Doc, it'll allow you to sign in For those of you that were able to listen to Henry's testimony that have been a part of our program since we listened to it a few moments ago, you'll see the code in the doc as well. Mentimeter is the teacher facing part of that website where you can set these up for yourself for use with your own students. I know one of the needs that we've all really had over the course of the last couple months is to find ways to keep our students engaged when we are meeting with them face-to-face in a virtual setting, not our traditional classrooms. And so Menti or Mentimeter has been a really great resource that I have found for use with my students and in my classroom. What's really cool about it is that it, as Gabriel mentioned in the chat box, it allows kids to share anonymous thoughts. So there is no accountability unless you choose to have them link their name if you're doing like an open-ended response. But for something like a word cloud, it's completely anonymous. Those of you that have been in the classroom for many years, you're probably familiar with Wordle. And so it's like a modern day Wordle because it's real time. You don't have to physically actually input the words in the Wordle. And just like Wordle, every time a word is entered, if it's entered more than once, it gets larger on the screen. So powerful is the response that many of us have had to Henry's testimony. I also see tolerance showing up quite strongly, upstander, diversity, and I also see words like respect, historian, learn, strong, true, and truth, empathy, relevant, and insight. At the end of the day, if you are the person running the Mentimeter, it will actually send you the option to download a PDF. So you can actually keep the student responses to reflect on for your own purposes. Additionally, if you, for example, I teach at a community college, and so my students are doing asynchronous learning. So I leave my Mentimeter open for a week, and I use it as a reflection activity during the lecture. So you can actually change the amount of time that the Mentimeter is open. The default is 48 hours, but you can leave it open to the week-long setting as well. And it's something that, students could engage in as well. Gabriel mentioned, his students download the results of their polls, and we're actually going to be using a poll here in just a little while. So that's one tool that I wanted to be sure to share with you because, we're really in this unique setting of trying to figure out how to navigate effectively teaching about challenging topics, difficult histories like the Holocaust, without having our students in the safety of our classroom. And so Echoes and Reflections has traditionally operated under a certain set of pedagogical principles. For those of you that are familiar with the US HMM guidelines for teaching the Holocaust, you'll see a lot of major similarities between these two sets of principles. We believe that it's important to define terms, and I'll show you a great tool in just a few minutes that you can use with your students to help them define terms that they'll encounter while studying this history. We also believe whether you're teaching about the Holocaust for a 45-minute class period or for a semester, it's important for your students to have some type of fundamental understanding of anti-Semitism. And I'll be sharing with you today some resources that will allow you to do that in either a more lengthy manner or a shorter manner if you're one of those people that's in a situation that does not have a lot of time in your own individual classroom. We also believe with any teaching of any history, of course, it's important to provide historical context. We also believe it's great for students to be able to utilize primary sources. And many of our primary sources, like Henry's story, for example, through his visual history testimony, help to teach the human story. We also believe that it's important to make the Holocaust relevant, but caution that one does so in a methodologically appropriate fashion. We always say we don't want to make comparisons of pain, we want to make connections. So the Holocaust wasn't better or worse than incident X in history. It was its own unique and terrible historic era. But there are lessons that we can learn from it, that we can make connections both to the past and present. And a lot of that can be done through encouraging critical thinking with your students and fostering empathy, while along the way ensuring a supportive learning environment. And I think that it's that last principle that is one that teachers really have been struggling with over the course of the last couple months. How do you ensure a supportive learning environment through a connection via a computer screen? And so I'm hopefully going to be sharing some resources with you over the course of the next couple of days that will allow you to create that supportive learning environment, whether you're in a traditional classroom setting or a virtual setting. And we'll be talking about some strategies that you can utilize to make sure that you're providing that support even in an online format. In addition to these pedagogical principles, I've also provided for you in the Google Doc that Gabriel has currently shared in the chat box some suggestions for teaching with visual history testimonies like that of Henry Ortelt. And I made mention of sharing Henry's testimony for a very specific reason. And that is because, to me, I think he helps to establish a supportive learning environment regardless of the classroom setting that you're in. My high school, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, was formerly called Robert E. Lee High School. We actually just underwent the name change last July 1st, so July 1st of 2019. We are located 45 minutes or so west of Charlottesville. Stanton's a fairly small town. Charlottesville is much bigger. So if you need to have a major medical procedure, or you want to go shopping, or you want to go, for a big night out on the town, Stanton's got a lot of great restaurants. But if you really want to, take somebody somewhere special, you go to Charlottesville. Many of my students' parents work there, and it's a place that they're very familiar with. And so back in August of 2017, we had just started school the week before the incidents in Charlottesville occurred. And I had actually had my Holocaust and Genocide Studies class that semester. My first day, I do defining the Holocaust, why we're here. My second day, I do some resources on membership and group identity. And then on days 3 and 4, we take a look at both historical and contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism, using some of the resources that I'm going to be sharing with you today. And I'll never forget that Friday, a student looked at me and he said, "Hey, are you going to that thing in Charlottesville this weekend?" And I had known about it. I mean, because with having a high school named Robert E. Lee, anything, about it was something that was on our radar. And I looked at him, I said, "No, I don't think so." At the time, I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I just didn't really think it was something that she would even, be able to go to for the day. And that was kind of it. And it kind of left my mind. I went to bed early that night, because you guys know there's no tired, like first week of school tired when you're a teacher. And so when I woke up the next morning after, sleeping in a little bit and seeing the news, I was just astounded. Seeing people marching and chanting outside the synagogue that friends of mine attended and that I had spoken in previously. Seeing, people demonstrating on the lawn of UVA. Was absolutely horrifying. And after, kind of spending much of the morning and afternoon watching the news and trying to process what was happening, and seeing, the tragedies that affected, the state police and Heather Heyer, and just being absolutely heartbroken and devastated, that night I went into teacher mode. And I thought, what am I going to do? How am I going to talk to this about my students on Monday? And I grappled with it. I reached out to colleagues, and in the end, my heart went to Henry. And I thought, here's a way to safely start a conversation, not only on a difficult subject, but on a difficult subject that in cases is personally impacting my students. And so that's why I wanted to open our work today with Henry's testimony, to get you all exposed to thinking about him and how to use visual history in your classrooms. Henry, during the Holocaust, he was born in 1921, and so he was 18 years old when the Second World War broke out. So he was the age of some of my seniors. And, he also had a very lived experience during the era. He was in Theresienstadt in the ghetto, which we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. And then he was later processed through Auschwitz-Birkenau before being sent to several other subsequent concentration and forced labor camps, including Sachsenhausen and Flossenburg. And he then later moved to the United States and shared his story. And so that was one of the reasons why I wanted to open our work with Henry today. So now that I've shared these 9 pedagogical principles with you, I'd like you to go back to the Menti, and you'll notice the next two slides deal with these pedagogical principles. I'd like you to take a few moments and just reflect. First question, which principle do you think that you do pretty well with in your classroom, that you deal with pretty effectively? And which principle, then for the second question, do you think you could work on a little bit more? And for those of you that are just joining in, the code is on the Google document that Gabriel has shared with everybody that we're using as our sign-in. But I've also shared the code with you in the chat box as well. So again, you're going to go to menti.com on either a separate device or by opening a new tab. And then you're going to be asked to enter the code 877802. And I'd like you to take a few moments and just reflect on what you do well so far and what you need to work on. So let's take about 3 to 4 minutes to do those reflections. So this should be specific to your work with the Holocaust, Lauren. Great question, thank you, and sorry for not clarifying that. So when teaching the Holocaust, or what you think, if you haven't taught it yet, what you think you might feel like you're strong at, and then what you feel like you might need to work on. So as you guys are continuing to reflect on that, I'm just looking through our sign-in chart, got some great songs in there. It's great to see somebody from Virginia. Laura, welcome from Dinwiddie. More PA people, Haverford, not too far from Reading. Tracy or Corey, whoever mentioned the Paw Patrol theme song, I get you. My daughter's 6, but yeah, I can cue that up in my brain real quick. Okay, so let's take about another minute and a half. And again, Gabriel has shared the attendance login and resources link in the chat box. Yep, Corey, I totally get it. I love flowers. All right, so I've got the Menti results up on the screen right now from our first question. And I love what I'm seeing here. There's, some really interesting and varied feedback. And if you haven't yet entered your response, that's okay. You can still add to it and it'll update us live time. I also, think it's great to see that many of you thought you were strongest at ensuring a supportive learning environment. And I think that that's something, again, that we've all been struggling with in the time of COVID, with reaching our students virtually. And so if you've got any really great strategies to ensure that supportive learning environment or to foster empathy during this time, please feel free to share them with us in the chat box. And I know that would also be a really phenomenal discussion on the page. Gabriel's had some really fantastic discussions that have gotten started there. And so I think ensuring a supportive learning environment in times of COVID and fostering empathy in times of COVID are two that I'd love to hear more about. I also see using primary source materials, something history teachers are great at. And we've really kind of got a group across the screen, and so that's great to see. And then we all, of course, have our own strengths in our approaches and then our areas of growth. And again, looking through this, I see a lot of different areas where people want to grow. And so I'd encourage you to keep this specific pedagogical principle in the front of your mind as we go through our work over the course of the next couple of days. Contextualizing history, making it relevant, adding more primary sources, utilizing primary sources to get students to engage and not just read it because it's a sign. And so hopefully the visual history testimonies in particular will aid you with that. Need to work on getting students more interested in research, definitely. I just finished up National History Day for the year, and I know for me personally, that's been an area that has really helped get my students excited about doing research, but I think that's an area of growth for me as well. Making sure students are able to ask questions about how people felt in that time today, the human story, how the time period is similar in the inequity and racial empathy that's needed now. And some other, fostering empathy is critical, but how to do it. And I think that's realistic for many of us as well. And, if students feel like they aren't doing it, witnessing it, that it's not happening, contextualization I see as well. And yeah, the empathy, again, getting caught in the weeds can be a challenge, especially when we're driving towards meeting specific state standards and so on and so forth. So this is what I call like the brick wall display in Menti. Obviously, the previous slide was a poll. So if you are not yet done entering your content on there, that's okay. You can feel free to continue to add to it. And what I will actually do then is download the PDF of this tonight and share it with all of you in the chat box tomorrow as a file, so you can see what the output from the Menti is. And I see Clarence mentioning, one of the ways that he's working to foster empathy is bringing in real-time and personal testimony regarding his family ties to law and police and putting them in a research and expository of their life. Thank you, Clarence, for sharing that on a topic that is surely very relevant in this time period. So we're now going to head to the Echoes and Reflections website, and I'm actually going to take us back to the main landing page and sharing the page with you in the chat box if you would like to follow along. When you go to our specific landing page, you see some general announcements in the banners across the top, and the heart, though, of what we're going to be looking at today is in this Teach section of the website. And so when you get into the Teach section, the pedagogy for instruction that we've already talked about is included here. And I've also provided that link for you in the Google Doc. The lesson plans, which are stretched across our 11 units, which we're going to go into in just a moment, are right here. We have a timeline, which we're also going to talk about this week. And then we also have an audio glossary, which is something that I want to share with you specifically. You'll see down below we have some audiovisual posters available. We also have specific supporting resources for teaching Schindler's List. This is a resource that many educators use. And then we also, this past January, launched a podcast called We Share the Same Sky with our partners at the USC Shoah Foundation. It's a 7-part podcast. It's incredibly powerful about the story of a young journalist who was retracing her grandmother's journey during the era of the Holocaust. And it brings in some really relevant present day concepts, as well as the power of testimony through the podcast medium. So the audio glossary is what is presently on your screen, and this will help you achieve that very first pedagogical principle, defining terms. And you can see here that it is, of course, like a regular glossary. It's alphabetically organized. But then what we also have is for words that are not familiar to most native English speakers, we have what's known as the audio option. And so
Auschwitz.
hover over the speaker, it pronounces the word for you. So you no longer have to fake how to say Belzec or Majdanek. You can practice with the audio glossary if you're a teacher. But it's also really powerful too for students because a lot of times, particularly in the upper grade levels, we turn students loose on their own with resources that might have words that are unfamiliar to them as it relates to the study of the Holocaust. So what I do with my students is I pin the URL at the top of the page into our learning management system, and then my students have access to it during the duration of our study of the Holocaust. So if I have them reading a memoir at home and they encounter the word action and they're not really sure exactly what it means, they can not only hear it pronounced,
Aktion.
but they can also then read the definition of it. And so this audio glossary is one of the assets from Echoes and Reflections that I'm excited to share with you today. Next, we're going to go into our lesson plans. As you'll see here along the left-hand side of the page, we have 11 units. They could theoretically be taught by starting with Unit 1, studying the Holocaust, and going in a step-by-step order all the way through to Unit 11 on contemporary anti-Semitism. If you had that unlimited time, that is definitely an option. Of course, many of us don't have that flexibility, so we can go through and just pick and choose resources and assets that fit with your particular classroom. So I'm going to go into the unit on anti-Semitism, where we're going to be doing our work for the remainder of today. And I'm going to show you initially how the unit is set up so that you are able to get familiar with our layout. And then we're going to be delving into some specific resources within it. And so every unit in Echoes is set up in the same fashion. We begin with an opening quote that often comes from a primary source, typically a piece of visual history testimony within the unit. We align specific keywords to the unit. We give you some great background information. If you're new to teaching about a topic like anti-Semitism, it's great to read. And if you're a more seasoned veteran, it's great to review. We then also have a video toolbox, which is about a 10 to 15 minute long video for most of our units that give you as an educator background on teaching about the topic. We provide you with specific objectives, which are great for lesson planning. And for those of you who are in Common Core states, we have the Common Core alignments for this content. Every unit also has pinned to it our testimony video guide, which lists all of the over 6 testimonies that are available to you in Echoes and Reflections, what they're about and their runtime, as well as where you can find them. And we'll go more into that specific resource tomorrow. We also individually list all of the other assets that are involved in the Echoes and Reflections units in the asset resource guide. Then we go down through, and each unit has 2 to 3 lesson plans that are embedded within it, as well as the supporting content for those lessons along the right-hand side of the screen. And we'll be coming back to those in just a moment. And then down at the bottom of each unit, we have our reflect and respond questions, which are great for class discussions, and for journaling. I use these in Google Classroom with my students during the virtual teaching that I did this spring. They were great writing prompts, but you can use them in a variety of different ways. You can also use them in Flipgrid, for those of you that are familiar with Flipgrid, and if you're not, definitely be sure to check it out. And I know Gabriel's provided some additional great resources on Flipgrid on the Facebook page. And then lastly, we have our Making Connections section, which are extension activities related to a specific topic. In this case, some of our extension activities go into modern day anti-Semitism and hate groups, which are also further discussed in Unit 11, which deals with contemporary anti-Semitism. but there's a lot of really great content here. Also, during the duration of today, if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box. I'd love to hear from you guys. What we're going to do now and for the remainder of today's program is to dive a little bit more heavily into anti-Semitism. And the very first resource that I'm going to share with you is about midway down the page. It's a student handout that's called Anti-Semitism. And I'm opening it up as a view more option. It'll actually show you the physical handout that you can share either virtually, digitally, by just simply sharing the URL at the top of the page, or you can see that printing it is also an option, and it's very printer friendly. It prints very neatly and cleanly, and it's great to use. So what I'd like to do now is I'd love to have a volunteer to get a new voice. I'd love to have a volunteer raise their hand and then offer to read this definition for us. I'd love to have somebody raise their hand. Don't be shy. You don't have to turn your camera on, just your mic. All right, so Lindsay, if you can unmute yourself and read this definition for us, please.
Anti-Semitism is the term for hatred of Jews as a group or a concept. Hatred of Jews has existed since ancient times, and in the 19th century, it was being influenced by modern scientific ways of thinking. The word anti-Semitism was coined in Germany by political activist Wilhelm Marr to represent this newer way of thinking. Semitism supposedly expressed all things Jewish, since at the time national groups were frequently defined by their language, and the traditional language of Jews is Hebrew, which is a Semitic language. Of course, there is no such thing as Semitism, and all speakers of Semitic languages never belonged to the same national or ethnic groups. Anti-Semitism may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of Jews, their supposedly evil nature, or other negative ideas about Jews. It may include political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or other stereotyped views about Jews derived from racial or other ideologies.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thanks to your assistant as well. So anti-Semitism is the term for hatred of Jews as a group or a concept. What do you think the difference is between hating anything as a group versus hating it as a concept? Feel free to take a stab at that in the chat box, or if you'd like to raise your hand and share, you certainly may do so as well. But what do you think the difference is between hating something as a group or a set of people as a group, or hating them as a concept? Okay, so Megan mentions not liking people versus not liking what they stand for. Debbie mentions as a concept, not having really interacted with the group. Yeah, just based on preconceived notions. Any other thoughts? And if there's anybody that wants to share but can't find the raise hand feature, if you unmute your mic, I can also see you. Unmute it so you can share that way as well. Corey mentions hatred towards a group also seems like it could lead more easily and directly to biased actions, prejudice, discrimination, etc., as opposed to hatred as a concept. You cannot like a person's actions, but hating a person is wrong. I saw Mary Ellen's, I'm going to scroll back up for that particular one, but it's easier to hate a group than individuals. And Clarence mentioned hating something as a group versus a concept is hatred is learned. Yeah, and so all of these are really on point. And traditionally where I try to go with my students with this is if you hate a group of people as a group, they might be people that you've interacted with, that you know individuals from, but if you're hating them as a concept, the likelihood of you interacting with them is not likely. And so you're hating them based on, you know, things that you might have heard about them and so on and so forth versus your own individual interactions with them. And so I want you guys to keep that in mind as we head into our next activity, which is examining a map of communities, of Jewish communities prior to the Holocaust. And so I clicked on the map on the right-hand side to make it more visible. I'm clicking on the printable option of the map. I'm also going to be sharing that option with you in the chat box. And also great comment by Angela, hating as a concept is more abstract. No previous interaction, but what's been passed down is great. So if you want to examine this map more fully, I have shared it with you in the chat box and navigating away from it and meant to zoom in. And so I'm going to also zoom in to it on my screen. And so I'd like you to just take about 2 minutes and examine the map either through the link that I provided or through looking at the screen. And I'd like you to think about what comes to mind. And just share any thoughts that you might have either in the chat box, or I'm also going to share, yes, so great question, Rebecca. The bar graph is the number of Jews in that country. The pie chart is the percentage of the overall population that Jews make up. So thank you for asking that. So I've also shared with you a Padlet, and I know many of us are very familiar with Padlet, but if you're not, I wanted to make sure to share this as an option to interact with as well. When you go to the Padlet, you simply click on the little plus sign in the bottom right-hand corner or double click anywhere on the screen, and you can make a comment on the screen itself. And so I have shared the Padlet now on my screen so that you guys can see it. But this is another great way to get a, I have to change my privacy, my apologies. And you guys have permission to write. Okay, so if you might need to reload the Padlet, but if you're not familiar with Padlet, this is a great way to get images, video clips, or other assets into the hands of your students and to get them interacting in a way that is visible. What I do with my students is I ask them to sign their initials. I also ask them to make comments on other individuals' comments on the Padlet to have some classroom interaction. I'm going to keep you guys in the Padlet, but also display now on my screen again the map itself so you can see a clean copy of it. Mary Ellen, a Padlet lover, yes, Padlet's awesome. Didn't realize the concentration of the Jewish population in Poland and Russia. Those of you that are world history teachers probably already know that largely part of the reasoning behind this is that during the reign of Catherine the Great, she actually pushed the Jews out of the interior of Russia into the area that was so-called beyond the Pale of Settlement. And so many Jews ended up concentrated in what at this time then would become Poland or western parts of the Soviet Union. So that's why, despite her efforts, there are over 3 million Jews that are counted as part of the Soviet Union, but they're not largely in the interior. They're largely concentrated along the western border. Many students are shocked to see the strong concentration of Jews in these areas, and some of which, of course, by this time in history would be communist-controlled areas. And so that's actually going to help to foster some of the stereotypes of Jews in looking at, Jews are, communists and they're spreading communism, and they're part of the reason why Germany must target the Jews is to target the scourge of communism. Somebody mentioned on the Padlet, the population of Jewish people in most nations is minuscule, but they're scapegoats of many governments. And that's a connection that you can really make with your students. You don't pick on the majority group in a society, you pick on a minority group. And in this case, the Jews were the minority in most every country. Actually, every country on this map, even Poland, where there is the largest population in all of Europe, there's still only 10% of the population. I see somebody mentioning, were they located in cities or were they spread out? It's a great question. This map, unfortunately, in and of itself doesn't provide the answer to it, but USHMM has some more supporting focused maps in their Holocaust encyclopedia that explores topics like this. In Western Europe, traditionally, they're going to be in major cities, and most Jews were very assimilated, as we're going to see from a testimony that we're going to watch here in just a moment. But in Eastern Europe, you had Jews in agricultural areas, and then you also had Jews in major cities like Warsaw. In fact, Warsaw had one of the highest Jewish populations in all of the world prior to the Holocaust. I want to say it was third behind New York City and Jerusalem at that time in history, but it was definitely one of the top 3 centers of Jewish population at that time in history. So, just seeing your comments pop up on the Padlet are some really interesting things here. Patterns of migration due to the pogroms, yeah, as well. So a lot of the pogroms targeted this area because of the concentration of population. So that's a great connection to make as well. And then somebody mentioning, for being such a small minority, how could they truly have posed a political threat? And that's something that's great to ask students. It can be a great lead-in to an inquiry into this particular topic. Clarence mentioned having known as a youngster. I heard stories from our Jewish friends that lived through this time. There were camps where there were burn pits and things like that. Yeah, and there were places throughout Eastern Europe where Einsatzgruppen actions, we'll talk about later this week, targeted Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. There were, horrific sites of death camps throughout Europe that we'll also be talking about as well. And geography is so critical to this, as we're going to see when we get into our later exploration of the evolution of the camps and ghettos. You're going to see how where they're located correlates very closely with this map. So I love creating geographical connections across maps for students with this topic. I'd also like you to think about, with your students, saying, did most people hate Jews as a group, or did they hate them as a concept? And of course, I'm sure that many of you could already propose an answer to that based on the population that you see here. Many students are shocked to see that there are only less than 1% of the population being Jewish in Germany. And so that's something that they just absolutely cannot believe, is the originator of the Holocaust, that the Jewish population in Germany was so small. So that is a resource in this unit that I wanted to share with you. In my US and Virginia history class that I teach in some years, I only have 2 class periods to teach about the Holocaust. And so this is pairing this map with that definition is the way that I teach about anti-Semitism in my classes. I also share with them a testimony of a woman that I am going to introduce you to today. And her name is Margaret Lambert. Margaret was born in Germany, and she was born in 1914 in a town called Lofheim, Germany, as you can see here by her biography. She ultimately managed to escape to America in 1937, due in part to a wealthy friend of her family who was able to provide her with an affidavit. However, her father and the rest of her family had to stay in Germany until 1940, when they were allowed to immigrate to England. Margaret was an outstanding track and field athlete. She was actually eligible for competition in the 1936 Berlin Olympics, but because of the anti-Semitic attitudes of the Nazi German government, this opportunity was stripped from her. She later married Dr. Bruno Lambert, who was a fellow athlete, and he too was a German refugee. And she would ultimately become a high school PE teacher, settling in Queens, New York. So you can read more about Margaret on this bio. The bios are available just to show you here on each unit. Paired with the testimony, you have a full biography. Also, if you click on that full biography and again hit print, it is shareable to students, again, by clipping the URL at the top of the screen. I find a really great way to engage a disengaged student who likely will have some innate interest in learning about the Holocaust, is to share this link or even a printout of her biography or whatever speaker we're bringing in that day's biography, and say to the student, hey, tomorrow we're going to hear from Margaret Lambert. I'd really like you to listen to her testimony, and I would like you to introduce her to the class tomorrow. And that's been a really effective strategy for me to bring students into the fold. So Margaret's testimony is here on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm going to share it directly from our page, but it is also available via a YouTube link. And all of the testimonies in Echoes and Reflections are closed captioned. They also have shorter biographies at the bottom of the page. So I'm going to share two testimonies from Margaret back to back. For the first testimony, I'd like you to think about how would your students relate to her, and what does she share about her experiences with anti-Semitism? So here's Margaret.
I had a wonderful time. I had my mother and father, and I had an older brother, about 2 years older than I. And once we got over the sibling rivalry, we got to be very good friends, my brother and I. And my parents found out pretty soon that what Margaret wanted, Margaret got. And they let me be my own, because I was not the usual child. But I had my own way of dressing. I didn't like what my mother got for me. I wouldn't wear it. And I was strong-willed. And I knew what I wanted to do very early on in life. I wanted to be a coach, physical education teacher. My parents thought I was a little freaky with all this business about sports that I was so very into. I skated, I skied, I swam, I ran, I climbed. Through my sport activities, there were more non-Jewish people involved than Jewish people. I was the only girl in my class. I was the only Jew in my class, and it never made any difference. I mean, I never felt any anti-Semitism until a certain time. I always knew I was Jewish, but our house, there was no religion practiced, really. I always say, my father said, be a decent human being, that should be your religion, and I think I have practiced that, pretty much.
All right, so in the chat box, if you can pick one of the two questions that I have posted there, either how would your students relate to Margaret, or what does she tell us about anti-Semitism? And while you're doing that, I'm going to navigate to her second piece of testimony, which is in our Unit 3 on Nazi Germany. Let me get that ready to go. Feel free to share your answers. So Angela mentioned she would appeal to her strong personality and how active she was. Absolutely. The sports aspect, Rebecca mentioned, she teaches in a minority school and sports are important to students. Students would relate to her by being different and having non-typical interests. Jennifer mentions that her students would appreciate the way she's so confident about who she is, despite what other people think of who she should be. I absolutely love when she mentions she won't wear what her mother picks out for her. I remember putting my mom through that. And I have a feeling karma is going to come back to me. Gabriel mentions just being a good person, the golden rule. That's what she lives by. Being a decent human being. Yeah, and interestingly, she mentions that anti-Semitism wasn't really an issue. Yeah, Debbie mentions she didn't really experience it in her school years overall. One of the things about Margaret's testimony, she's actually one of the older individuals that's featured in Echoes and Reflections testimonies. Most of our testimonies are from people who experienced the Holocaust when they were the same age as most of our students. That was purposely done for student engagement. But Margaret's testimony, despite the fact that she is a little bit older when things begin to change, I think still makes a really large impact on her, because she's a teenager when things really begin to change for her. So what is that certain point? Well, I'm now going to share that with you. And for this clip of testimony with Margaret, which is going to be our closing activity for today, I want you to think about not only what she says about how things change, but also how we see the change in the delivery of her testimony.
It started in 1933, really. But I had very good friends of whom I knew that they were members of the Nazi Party since 1928. And she was one of my best friends. She didn't care that I was Jewish, and I didn't care that she was a Nazi. She was one of my sports friends, and we got along very well. But then, of course, in 1933, everything changed. Like overnight, you could not go into a public place, no restaurants, no swimming pools, no movies, nothing. You couldn't. You were not allowed in any public place anymore. And the people that you knew wouldn't talk to you anymore. Friends that you had, they would shun you, most of them. Not because they hated us all of a sudden, but they were all afraid, because that was the way it was. You talk to a Jew and you'll be punished. It was very hard. I was 19 years old, and all of a sudden I was shut off from everything. I got a letter from my sports club in Ulm that I wasn't welcome there anymore because I was Jewish, and that was the thing that I loved to do most, as I said before, sports. And all of a sudden that was finished. There was nothing I could do. We just were really vegetating, if you want to call it that.
So in a classroom setting, I'd give a little bit more wait time at the end of Margaret's testimony, because I think it's one that really requires some processing for students. But I do see that some of you have begun processing it in the chat box, mentioning that things like friends are scared to talk to her. She's more serious and somber. She goes from confident and almost a little defiant to feeling plucked from her world and everything ended. Friends become bystanders to the events happening and leave her hanging. Lindsay mentions the disbelief and how disheartened she became as her friends started to stay away from her. And I see we might have also had a little bit of audio difficulty, Nina. On the Google document, I do have links to Margaret's testimonies, so if you want to go back and listen to them on your own later, that is an option. So anti-Semitism, Clarence mentioned, is practiced against her, was by a group not so directly against her. It was not until her outstanding athletic ability to stand out to represent her above the non-Jews was she singled out as a group as the work of the Nazi SS. Rebecca mentions the tone in her voice changes when she realizes that the change happened. And I think for students, noting that this is a testimony that took place 50 years later is something that's really powerful. I love using visual history testimony with my students, not only to convey a message and to introduce them to people who experience these events, but to also help to develop their socio-emotional learning skills and also their media literacy skills by interpreting testimony, by seeing body language through the testimony that's being delivered. I think all of these things are really powerful gifts that we can give our students. Now, in the document, I've provided a link to our Summary of Anti-Semitism handout, which gives you a broader view of historical anti-Semitism that has occurred throughout time. And it's a longer read, so I didn't want to have us read it during our session today. And I've also provided you with a link to our Unit 2 materials. And if you scroll down in Unit 2, you'll see towards the bottom that there are multiple pieces of propaganda, many from the children's book, The Poisonous Mushroom, and one from an additional children's book from this time period. And if you have time before we meet back up tomorrow, a little bit of a homework assignment, I'd love to have you read that Summary of Anti-Semitism. And then I'd also love to have you examine those pieces of Nazi propaganda and just see what you think about it and how it ties into our work today. And perhaps, as Mary Ellen mentions, the insidious growth of the Nazi Party. So that concludes our session for today. I kind of packed us to the brim because I know we're going to be getting back together tomorrow. But if you do have any questions, you can feel free to either share them in the chat box or to email them to me at the email address that is also in the chat box. We will be here same time, same place tomorrow. I encourage you to feel free to, further explore the ECHO's website when you have time. We also have other upcoming events online that we'll be talking about towards the end of our work together this week. And we also have a great newsletter and blogs, articles, and essays that we'll talk about, as well as being on social media. And I know Gabriel's been tweeting about our session today. which has been quite amazing. So I thank you guys all so much for taking the time out of your busy days to learn with me and with Gabriel and everyone else here. I will be able to stay on for about another minute if there are any additional questions or comments, then I actually do have to pop into another call. It's the joys of Zoom world. But I thank you guys so much for being with us today, and we're really excited to work with you tomorrow.